Good afternoon. My name is Kendall Stegman. I am the Director of the Air Quality Division here at DEQ, and welcome to our first planning session for the oil and gas and power plant sectors 111D plans. This is the first time we've done, I think, something like this. Usually we do a proposal and we invite comment on those proposals. Today, we are starting get public engagement and public input on the front end. So we're hoping we get a lot of good dialogue today, a lot of good comments. And I got a lot of good input and information from, I know industries here, the general public, and I also know other states are on Zoom. So I look forward to all the engagement this afternoon. As many of you know, we're going to have a new administration come in January. And I've had a lot of questions. So are you moving forward? Yes, we're moving forward. Right now, these regulations are law. They are on the books. It's going to take a little bit for the administration and the new administrator to get their boots on the ground and figure out what direction they want to go to. However, as soon as we get that direction or guidance, we will act accordingly. We will pivot toward what the new administration decides. But right now, we are moving forward with our state implementation plan because we're on a tight time frame. We don't have a lot of time, and it's going to take a little bit for the administration to act on these existing rules. So we would like to start the process, start the engagement. So if these rules do remain intact, whether through the administration, through litigation, we want to be able to stay on time to be able to complete our state implementation plan, because we do not want a federal implementation plan in Oklahoma. We want to design a plan that's specific to our state and that will help the people of Oklahoma. So I just wanted to welcome y'all and kind of give our reasoning why we are having this meeting and why we're still continuing this process. And now Melanie Foster.
Thanks, Kendall. Can everybody hear me okay? Very good. So welcome again. And I am Melanie Foster. I'm the Rules and Planning Section Manager. And perfect. On the screen, you'll see our agenda for the day. I'm going to give a short overview of the state 111D process, and then Leon Ashford will be giving an explanation on the specifics as they relate to the electric generating unit or power plant sector. And that's going to be followed by then Tom Richardson explaining the specifics for the oil and gas sector. So after the presentations, you'll be given an opportunity to ask questions or share any initial feedback that you may have. And then finally, we'll wrap it up with some closing remarks about how to stay involved in this process. Next slide, please. Thank you. So some quick housekeeping reminders before we really get started. So we do want to remind our in-person and our online participants that this meeting is being recorded. And if you do provide feedback, you may be on video, on camera. So please be aware of that. We will be posting this recorded Zoom presentation to our website in a few days. Be sure, if you're an online participant, to rename yourself on Zoom so that it reflects your actual name, no device names or anything like that. And to cut back on any unintended interruptions, all online participants are currently muted, and they will be throughout the presentation. Once we get to the point where we're asking for feedback, we'll unmute those that wish to speak. In the meantime, those that are online, please be sure to use the Q&A feature to message the Zoom hosts if you have any trouble, and they will try to help you. And with all that out of the way, we'll go ahead and get started. Okay, so I'm going to walk you through the basics of what we're here to discuss, which is Oklahoma's obligation to create two 111D state plans. And hopefully you've already seen this graphic previously in our meeting notice or on our website. We are currently in this first yellow box, this public information session. And during this meeting, we want to give you some information and begin taking your feedback as well. Next slide. So to start off, just what is 111D? Well, 111D is a section and a paragraph within the Clean Air Act, which is in the United States Code or federal statutes. And I have the citation and verbiage here on the screen. in case you want to review it later, but essentially this is the enabling language that gives EPA the authority to require states to regulate existing sources that emit designated pollutants and would be covered by a new source performance standard or NSPS if the facility were new. Next slide. So now I'm going to discuss the actual regulations that stem from the 111 statutes. Most people think about 40 CFR Part 60 and think of new sources. And again, primarily that is the type of facilities regulated by this part. And I mentioned these are new source performance standards or NSPSs. They affect newly built, modified, or reconstructed sources, and they regulate what is termed affected facilities. They typically go into effect 30-60 days after the final rule is published in the Federal Register. These federal regulations automatically attach here in Oklahoma if you build, modify, or reconstruct an affected facility, and DEQ does request and receive delegation to enforce them. However, in addition to the traditional NSPSs, there are a number of subparts in Part 60 that are emission guidelines or EGs. These tell states, tribes, or territories to regulate existing sources by developing state standards. Emission guidelines specify designated facilities and are affected after the state, tribe, territory has their plan submitted and approved by EPA. So typically states need to do some sort of rulemaking to establish the state standards, and then compliant states will vary based on the applicable emission guideline. Again, NSPSs attach automatically to new sources that meet the criteria in the rule, and emission guidelines direct the states, or us in this case, to develop a plan and standards before they attach to the existing sources. Next slide. So Leon and Tom are going to be giving you more details on the specifics of each of these, but I wanted you to know where in the regulations to find the emission guidelines for the sources we are discussing today, as well as the corresponding NSPSs. So again, our focus for this 111D roadmap is on the emission guidelines in Quad OC, which is what we typically call it, and I'm using Quad OB. I'm not sure if our plant people are using Quad UB yet, but that's what I'm using. Next slide. So as the state develops its plan to address a new emission guideline, there are a few things that can take into consideration when developing the state standards. So first, EPA identifies in the emission guidelines the best system of emission reduction, or BSER. And BSER is a system that has been adequately demonstrated to control emissions of a particular pollutant from a particular type of source. It is therefore different depending on the pollutant being regulated, the type of industry, such as oil and gas versus electric generating, and sometimes even the individual types of units. So states use this BSER to help them develop state standards of performance. Because 111D regulates existing sources, there is some consideration that not all types of controls are possible or cost-effective as they might be if a facility were being newly built. This allows the state to consider remaining useful life and other factors or rule off when determining how to address existing sources. Some emission guidelines also include model rules, which are very similar to the NSPSs and can take some of the work out of developing state standards. Quad OC includes a model rule, Quad UB does not. Next slide. So besides the requirements in the specific emission guidelines themselves, there are also implementing regulations in 40 CFR subpart BA that tell states when, how, and what to put in their state 111D plans. It directs states to develop these plans within 18 months unless the applicable subpart has a different timeline. In the case of the two 111D plans we are discussing today, they each specify 2 years for state plan development. The implementing regulations is also where you will find the requirements for meaningful engagement, which is hopefully part of what we are accomplishing here today. It also provides for what happens if a state doesn't submit a plan at all or submits a deficient plan. In that case, EPA will issue a federal plan to regulate the existing sources within the state. Next slide. So again, I've generally covered what 111D is and how we got here. So I'm splashing this roadmap up again so I can preview the rest of the process really quickly. So you can see we plan to have another meeting to gather additional input early next year before we begin developing our rules. That's the second yellow box. Let me also note that this meeting today will likely be the only meeting where we are discussing both 111D plans at the same time. In the future, most meetings will be specific to one sector or the other. So now let's really briefly touch on the last two yellow boxes and the procedures for rulemaking and state plans. So as I already mentioned, we will need to draft rules for state performance standards for each 111D plan. I know many of you may already be familiar with our rulemaking procedures, but here's a quick rundown of what has to happen after we draft rules. The Oklahoma Register will print a notice of rulemaking intent. We will also notify our Gov Delivery subscribers and put information on our website. The notice of rulemaking intent will start a minimum 30-day written comment period. It will also include a hearing for verbal comments and a review at an Air Quality Advisory Council meeting. Should the Air Quality Advisory Council recommend the rules, they will go to the next Environmental Quality Board meeting. And if approved by the board, the rules will move on for legislative and governor review and approval. Typically, our rules are effective the September 15th after the spring legislative session. While the rules are making their journey through approvals, we will also be working on the state plan, which will tell EPA how the state rules will be used to comply with the emission guideline requirements. Once our draft 111D state plan is ready, we will have a 30-day public comment period and hold a public hearing on the state plan. Once all comments are addressed, the state plan will be submitted to EPA. And as you saw on our timeline, we are hoping this will happen in 2026. So now that you have a basic idea of the journey we are on, I will turn it over to Leon Ashford to talk about the specifics as they relate to the emission guidelines for greenhouse gases at electric generating units.
Good afternoon. My name is Leon Ashford, and I want to talk to you today about the emission guidelines for non-turbine fossil fuel fired electric generating units. This is a map of the state of Oklahoma with all the electric generating units located on the map. And next slide. This is a map of Oklahoma with only the affected generating units. Here, this is rule covers non-turbine generating units. So there's a lot of turbines out there. Next slide. Designated facilities that have a list of the designated facilities. On the left, there's the coal generating units, and on the right, there's gas units. There's roughly 6 coal generating plants and 7 coal gas generating plants in the state of Oklahoma that have affected units. Next slide. On April 25th, 2024, EPA announced the standard. Then on May 9th, 2024, the rule was published in the Federal Register. So on May 9th, 2026, our state plan will be due. That's 2 years, and that'll be a short time frame to try to get everything done. Now, a couple other special dates. January 1st, 2030 is a compliance date for gas units and medium-term coal units. They have to be in compliance at that time. January 1st, 2032 is a compliance date for the long-term coal units. They give you 2 extra years to try to put on carbon capture and storage. And then on January 1st, 2032, coal units that cease operation before this date are not subject to the guidelines. So they won't have guidelines are subject to, but they still will have some paperwork that they have to work. Next slide. So again, that's a road we're traveling on, and it ought to be very interesting. We're looking for getting comments from you as much as possible. Next slide. This is BSER at a glance. On the left side, it's coal-fired boilers. On the right side, it shows the gas units. For coal-fired boilers, the determination is when is that unit going to retire. And for the long-term units, if they're running after 2030, they have to have carbon capture and storage with 90% capture rate. If they if they run past 2032, but shut down before 2039, they can do medium term. And that's 40% firing with natural gas. If they close down before 2032, then there's no requirement for them other than the paperwork. And then for natural gas units, it depends on the capacity factor. It's how much the unit ran. If it runs above 45%, you're considered a base load unit. And that's not totally unheard of, but there's not a whole lot of base load units out there. If you run somewhere between 8% and 45%, you're an intermediate load unit, and you'll have 1,600 pounds of CO2 per megawatt gross that you have to comply with. In the low load units, less than 8% capacity factor, you've got well, you have a standard that's there, 130 pounds CO2 per MMBTU. Next slide. And in this rule, we have increments of progress for the medium and long-term coal units. Basically, you have to have a plan and hit certain date marks to show that you're progressing in a satisfactory manner to be able to hit your end date. Next slide. Reporting obligations and milestones for affected EGUs that permanently cease operation. EPA's final emission guidelines retain reporting obligations and milestones for only the medium-term coal-fired category and affected medium-term category and affected EGUs that invoke rule off based on a unit's remaining useful life. And for these sources, they have to submit an initial milestone report 5 years before the date that it will permanently cease operations. They have to submit an annual report every intervening year, and then a final milestone report of the status no later than 6 months following the committed closure date. Next slide. Support for reliability. You have several options for the supporting reliability. One of them is the way the rule is structured. You have 2 extra years for carbon capture and sequestration, if that's the option that you go with. You have the remaining useful life and other factors provision. Remaining useful life and other factor provision to address reliability in state plans as well as in state plan revisions should the circumstance change. So if there's something happens and you've got to change the plan somehow, and we're in the middle of this, then we can make that change. It's not totally set in stone. You have compliance flexibilities, a flexible annual average compliance period. You have possibly emissions trading and averaging, or an option to do mass-based compliance equivalency. And the fourth reliability measure, reliability mechanisms. You have 2 optional reliability related instruments. A short-term mechanism to provide flexibility for units responding to grid emergencies, and a reliability assurance mechanism for units with retirement dates, for units with retirement dates with a documented and verified reliability need. Next slide. Remaining useful life and other factors rule off. Okay, it's intended as a limited variance from the EPA's determinations to address unusual circumstances at particular facilities. And it allows states to consider rule off if they demonstrate one of these three following. And the following are, if you have an unreasonable cost resulting from a plant age, location, or basic process design, physical impossibility of installing necessary control equipment, or third, other factors specific to the facility that make an application of less stringent standard or a final compliance time significantly more reasonable. Next slide. Once again, this journey, this is the first step. I encourage you to make us all the comments that you possibly can. And then next slide. This, the first line is our email address. It's an email box specifically for this 111D work. The second line is the web page. If you want to refer back to it, whenever we have requested information from the electric generators to find out what their plans for their different facilities are. And once we know that and can we'll try to put that on the web page so the public will be aware of what the plans are, and you'll be able to make more informed comments at that time. And the third line is for you to sign up for notifications from delivery. Thank you.
Welcome. Good afternoon. I'm Tom Richardson. I'm an engineer with the Rules and Planning section in the Air Quality Division of the Oklahoma DEQ. The topic I'm covering today are the emission guidelines for greenhouse gas emissions from existing crude oil and natural gas facilities. Next slide. So this is a summary of the topics I'm going to cover in today's meeting. First of all, just a quick overview of the emission guidelines themselves. We've been using the term Quad OC, that is the emission guidelines. Quad OB would be the new source performance standards that are already in place. And again, this is a series of EPA rulemakings going back, I think the first Quad O rules came into effect in about 2011. Next, I'll be talking about Oklahoma's oil and gas sector, a description of the sector and the designated facilities under the EPA emission guidelines. Next, we'll be discussing EPA's model rule. Unlike the utility sector, there is a model rule that EPA has put into place. We'll be going over a few of the specifics of the model rule. Next, we'll talk about policy options. Then rule off remaining useful life and other factors, specifically with regard to the oil and gas sector. Then we'll talk about getting questions from stakeholders, and lastly, how to participate in the process. Next slide. Emission guidelines, the screen shows an image of the Federal Register notice with the final rule. In the upper right is a completely unreadable table showing all the designated facilities in this sector, quite a few. And in the lower right are a series of dates. So the date of final rule publication, the effective date of that rule, and then in red, the due date for the state 111D plan submission, March 9th of 2026, and then the compliance date for state rules, which is March 9th of 2029. Next slide. So a summary of emission guidelines, subpart Quad OC requirements. First of all, the emission guidelines are actually addressing states. So it doesn't actually, the emission guidelines don't address the facilities directly or the owner and operators of those facilities. Actually, it sets requirements for states, and then the states have to develop the emission guidelines. So that's one difference between emission guidelines and new source for performance standards. Further, it applies to existing sources, and existing is in red because this is an area that's different from the new source performance standards that have been in place, again, for this sector starting in 2011. And it applies to facilities that commence construction, modification, or reconstruction on or before December 6th of 2022. And that's the date of the proposal, or actually the supplemental notice of proposed rulemaking. Further, the emission guidelines establish guidelines and compliance schedules for the control of greenhouse gases. in this case in the form of methane for the designated facilities in this sector. And I have a table that's pulled from an EPA document, and we'll quickly go over the designated facilities and then discuss some more of the issues. First of all, wells, there are requirements that are applicable to wells. Second, centrifugal compressors, and those are centrifugal compressors not located at a well site. Next slide. Reciprocating compressors, again, each reciprocating compressor is a designated facility under the emission guidelines, but note a reciprocal compressor located at a well site is not a designated facility. Process controllers that are the collection of natural gas driven process controllers are designated facilities. Pumps, against pumps driven by natural gas are designated facilities under the emission guidelines. Next slide. Storage vessels. And this is kind of a novel approach that EPA took for Quad OB and Quad OC. Previously in Quad O and Quad OA, it was an individual tank rather than the collection of tanks that constitute a tank battery. So this is Quad OC follows Quad OB in collectivizing the group of storage vessels as a single designated facility. And the facilities that are subject to the emission guidelines are those with the potential to emit 20 tons per year or greater of methane. Fugitive emission components are the collection of components at a well site, centralized production facility, or compressor station. And lastly, process unit equipment. Next slide. The oil and gas sector in Oklahoma is an extremely important sector in terms of economic impact, the number of facilities, and this state of Oklahoma's history. The information on this slide was provided by the Oklahoma Corporation Commission in a presentation to EFO on June 20th of this year. Just the magnitude of the facility, the number of plugged wells, over 200,000, over 500,000 known wells drilled within Oklahoma's history, and then miles of active pipelines, a number of oil and gas operators. With regard to active wells, there are over 76,000 crude oil wells and over 47,000 natural gas wells. In addition, we have injection and disposal wells and other wells. So this is a sector with a broad impact within the state of Oklahoma. Next slide. The model rule. Next, I'd like to provide a brief overview of the requirements in EPA's model rule and provide links to the model rule for people that like to look into this further. That's a citation from the electronic CFR. What is the model rule and what is it in this subpart? Next slide. Highlighting a few areas. So there are 9 different components of the model rule that are shown on the slide. I'm going to highlight the emission limits, emission standards, and the operating limits for 3 key designated facilities or classes of facilities. Again, we're not going to go into all the other issues. The notice is quite long and the requirements are quite detailed. Next slide. So 3 particular categories I think are worthy of note for today's presentation. Why? Because of their ubiquity, because they're just widespread within the sector across the state. And second, because of novelty. So the first category, storage vessels, is both ubiquitous and novel. Ubiquitous in the sense that practically every well site in the state of Oklahoma has storage vessels. Novel in the sense that EPA has now put the category of storage vessels as the entire tank battery. So an entire tank battery with the potential to emit of 20 tons per year or more of methane is subject to these emission guidelines under the model rule. What would that entail? That would entail a requirement for 95% reduction of methane. Typically, that would be achieved either through a flare or a vapor recovery unit. Next slide. The next slide refers to super emitters, and super emitters are defined broadly by EPA. This is a bit of a summary. As an emissions event, the magnitude of 100 kilograms per hour more of methane. The magnitude of emission events like that can be detected by a variety of methods, including by satellite. And this is a satellite image showing a plume in Oklahoma. So under the model, under the super emitter program, a third party can notify EPA, and then EPA can notify an oil and gas operator of the event. And then the oil and gas operator would have to investigate and address the event if it turns out to be from the source owned by the owner operator. Next slide. The next category is fugitive emissions. And so fugitive emissions, again, are ubiquitous throughout the sector. And EPA has, under the model rule, has developed different requirements based on where those fugitive emission sources are located. So single wellhead, which are only well sites or small well sites, there's a requirement for quarterly audible, visual, and olfactory monitoring surveys. And this monitoring would occur until the well site has been closed. The next category is multi-wellhead only sites with 2 or more wellheads. It requires both the quarterly AVO monitoring surveys, the audible, visual, and olfactory, and then a requirement for first attempt at repair on discovery, and then final repair within 15 days of the first attempt at repair. Further, there's a semi-annual optical gas imaging monitoring requirement, typically with an IR camera or other device, and then additional attempts at repair, and then final repair within 30 days of the first attempt. And again, the fugitive monitoring continues for all well sites until this well site has been closed. Next slide. For fugitive emissions at well sites and centralized production facilities, there's a bi-monthly AVO monitoring survey requirement, quarterly optical gas imaging monitoring, first attempt repair within 30 days, final repair attempt, or final repair rather required within 30 days of the first attempt. And once again, the monitoring continues for the lifetime of the well or until closure. Next slide. For compressor stations, monthly AVO monitoring surveys, quarterly optical gas imaging monitoring, and again, first attempt of repair within 30 days, final attempt 30 days after the first attempt. So again, these are fugitive components that are ubiquitous without the oil and gas sector, and increasingly stringent requirements depending on the complexity of the facility. Next slide. The model rule. So this page has links to the model rule and additional information. And again, I think as Kendall and Melanie have pointed out, the presentation will be placed on our well site some number of days after this, and there will be links that will be active. Further, a recording of this presentation will be provided as well. So again, the first link is to EPA's oil and natural gas methane rules site. The next link is a summary of key components. The third link is for the summary of requirements in the Clean Air Act for Section 111D plans, specifically for the crude oil and natural gas sector. And lastly, EPA's methane super emitter program webpage. Next slide. Rule-off. Melanie and Leon have both mentioned rule-off. Rule-off has a slightly different flavor for different sectors. This is the statutory language. I think Melanie actually had practically the same language up on her slide. But the last paragraph below that's isolated is the paragraph that mentions rule-off. Next slide. And again, you start with statutory language and then you get into EPA rule. And this is a fact sheet based on EPA's supplemental proposal and talking about requirements for rule-off for the oil and natural gas sector. I'm not going to read through the entire set of bullets, but I would like to highlight there are exemptions that can be justified if the cost of control is unreasonable due to a facility's age, location, or basic process design. If it's physically impossible or technically impossible to install an emission control, or other factors specific to a facility that are fundamentally different from factors considered by EPA when EPA determined the best system of emission reductions, or BSER. So those are the categories that would be used to either exempt or postpone regulations or reduce the stringency for some facilities. Next slide. Policy options. So again, today's meeting is upstream of any policy development. So we are basically laying out the process for developing policy, and these are possibilities. And again, we're not sharing any policy options today. So one policy option would be the adoption of the model rule promulgated by EPA. Another option would be to exclude some classes of facilities altogether. Another possibility is to delay the requirements for some classes of facilities while implementing other requirements immediately or at least on the schedule required by EPA. Further, we could focus on specific emission units for exclusions or delays in applicability. And lastly, exclusions or delays could be based on the age of the facility, the emissions from the facility, the production-based exclusions, or other criteria. So all of these are open in terms of development of policies to implement our state 111D plan. Next slide. Targeted stakeholder questions. Leon Ashford has already submitted questions to the electric generating utility sector. We are developing questions and targeting those questions to both industry stakeholders and communities. We haven't yet shared those, so this is the first time we're sharing, but we are really welcoming feedback from our industry and community stakeholders. Specifically from industry stakeholders, the number of facilities that fall into different categories, the number of well sites, central tank batteries, compressor stations, other facility types. Further, feedback on the type of equipment found at model facilities. So a lot of oil and natural gas sites have a group of, say, 2 produced water tanks, a single crude oil tank, a heater treater, a pump jack. That sort of information is helpful in categorizing the emissions and determining whether some of those facilities could be excluded from these requirements. Further, the estimated methane emissions from model facilities that fall into different categories. So we've had some informal feedback already that, for example, some studies of some abandoned wells have found very little emissions. That information would be helpful in guiding our next, our selection of policies. Further, summing emissions from different categories of facilities, that would also be helpful. And item 5 is particularly important, and that's the economic impact of the rules. If the model rule that EPA developed is implemented as written, how many facilities would be expected to be closed? There would be a loss of jobs. What would be the magnitude of job losses? What loss of revenue would occur as a result of those rules? And further, any additional information would help inform our rule development in our State 111D plan. Next slide. These are questions for community stakeholders. So 1, the proximity of facilities to home, schools, and work. 2, designated facility impacts, whether those are health effects or environmental impacts. 3rd, and maybe more importantly, in economic impacts. Some communities are especially dependent on the oil and gas sector for employment, or also revenue for some areas. And lastly, other concerns. Next slide. Additional outreach and requests for feedback. So the Oklahoma DEQ will request additional feedback from stakeholders to develop these a broad policy approach that will be shared during the next major milestone. So here again, I think this slide is showing the image that's been shown multiple times. So today we are not sharing any policies at all. What we are doing is requesting feedback that will inform our selection of policies. So for a 60-day period, we're going to be requesting feedback and interacting with various stakeholders. And then the next yellow box, after we've received information, we will develop broad policy outlines. So again, we're not talking about rulemaking. We're just talking about sharing the outlines of policy. When we have those policies to share, we'll have another meeting. And as Melanie and Leon, I think, and Kendall have all pointed out, at that point, we'll probably diverge. So today we have both the electric utility sector and the oil and gas sector today. But when we're actually, when we're sharing our policy outline, we will at that point break apart and probably have a meeting specific to the oil and gas sector, a separate meeting for the electric utility sector. So again, this is upstream of those meetings. So this is just a process discussion and a request for feedback. Again, there will be opportunities for additional engagement during the 60-day information feedback period. So we don't have rules that are in play. So we are welcoming any feedback from any of our stakeholders. Would be happy to engage. And again, engagement is encouraged. Next slide. How to participate in the process. Please check for updates on the Air Quality Division's 111D page. The link is provided there. Please sign up to receive future notifications from the Gov Delivery site about the DEQ's 111D activities by subscribing to the Air Quality Public Notice Listserv. And by the way, apparently we have 2 different listservs, and I think that sometimes is confusing, but we've decided that this particular listserv will be used for announcements on the development of our 111D plan. Further, please submit questions and feedback to our State 111D plan email address, and that address is shown. And Leon pointed out there's a separate email address for the electric generating utilities sector. This is for the oil and gas sector, and this isn't a one-time request. In other words, you could request additional discussion. There are opportunities for additional back and forth. And again, we're going to be soliciting feedback on policy options through February 3rd of 2025. At that point, we'll take the information we've received and we'll develop broad policy outlines. And then we'll come back with additional public meetings with those broad policies. So one of the reasons we've taken this process, and this is kind of novel for us, is EPA in a number of rulemakings has talked about meaningful engagement. And they've criticized some state and local agencies for what they perceive as a lack of meaningful engagement. And our belief is meaningful engagement needs to occur upstream of policy development. So if you have rules that you're sharing, if the rules have already been developed, there's probably less opportunity for meaningful engagement. So we've moved the engagement process upstream of rule development. In fact, this is even upstream of policy development. So we would encourage all of our stakeholders to provide feedback at this opportunity. And it doesn't have to be today. It could be through the email or other meetings. And then once we obtain information from our various stakeholders, we'll come back with policy options and we'll request another round of feedback. Only after that process will we develop a rule package. And then we'll present the rule package the way we do with our formal rulemaking, the process that Melanie described earlier. So please remain engaged. Please feel free to share thoughts today. Please feel free to email us or contact us if you have additional thoughts. And again, the process is open and we're welcoming feedback from all of our stakeholders. Next slide. So now I'm going to turn it over to Christina Hagens, who is online, and she is going to provide information on how during the remaining time for this meeting, people could provide or ask questions, provide feedback. And we're requesting questions and feedback both from the audience here in the multipurpose room, but also from our stakeholders that are online through Zoom. So at this point, I'll turn it over and ask Christina Hagens to share the procedures. Thank you.
Thanks, Tom. Before I get started, can everyone in the room hear me all right? Awesome, thank you. All right, as Tom said, my name is Christina Hagens and I will be acting as your moderator for this meeting. And just before we dive into that, just a few reminders up top. So as you have probably noticed, this is being recorded and will be shared on our website afterwards. Please make sure your display name is accurate on Zoom, just so we can better call on you and identify you if you're wanting to speak. And in order to rename yourself, you will have to find the Participants tab kind of down at the bottom of your screen. Look for you and then go to the three dots on the right and click Rename. Please keep in mind for any comments and questions that they are all appropriate, and if we have any issues, we can remove participants as needed. And if you have any technical issues with this meeting, there are 3 DEQ staff handling the behind-the-scenes logistics, so you can use the Q&A feature to also ask about those things. Next slide, please. All right, so for virtual participants, if you would like to ask a question or provide any verbal feedback, we are going to be using the raise hand feature, which should be at the bottom of your screen. And if you're not seeing it, click on the 3 dots or the More tab on the right, and you will just raise your hand and wait to speak, and I will call on you and unmute your line for you. For those that are calling in, raise hand is *9 on your phone keypad. And if you are calling in as well, you might have to unmute yourself using *6 as well. Once you are unmuted, please state your name and affiliation, and you will have approximately 3 minutes to make a comment. All right, so we are starting with the questions and feedback. So go ahead and raise your hand online if you would like to ask a question. And as we wait for online participants to raise their hands, we will begin with a few in-person comments first. So Melanie?
We're gonna go back and forth between in-person and online, as Christina said. So is there anyone in the room right now that would like to come up to the lectern and give a comment or question on the record? Christina, I am seeing none.
I am also seeing no raised hands online at this moment.
Give it just a couple of minutes. If we don't have anyone in the room or online that wishes to comment or ask a question, we will go to a 15-minute break. And at the point when we don't have anyone else that wants to comment, we will come up to the podium. Please state your name and affiliation for the record.
Charles Teagle with the OEPA. So this is my first time to go through this. Process seems not very interactive. So are there points along the rulemaking other than these formal gates, as you pointed out earlier, where there's interaction between the industry and the guidelines or rules as they're being written? Or is it, we'll take your input, we'll develop the rules, we'll issue the rules, you'll comment, and that's it? So how does this work?
Me to take this, or you will? So I'll start with, because you are oil and gas related, it is going to be slightly different between the two processes. But as Tom flashed up on the screen, he's got some questions, both for industry and for the public. And he does plan to put those out during the 60-day period and get feedback on those questions and kind of target some of that. So we're hoping that will generate a bunch of the feedback that's into, again, the broad policy portions. So when we come back at that next meeting, as he alluded, and we start talking policy, then you can really, I think, dig into and say, yeah, this doesn't work, or this does work, or did you think about this? At any time, though, we welcome any industry or other group or consortium to contact us through the email and say, hey, we've got some thoughts and ideas. We'd like to have a meeting, and we'll try and make that happen anywhere in the process. I will say, as you kind of alluded to, once we do get to the point where we've written and drafted a rule, yes, it becomes much more prescriptive. It makes it a lot harder, as Tom alluded to kind of turn the ship if we've picked a way to go. So we're hoping in these first two kind of big meetings that we have steered generally in the right direction.
So how do we get to having the interaction prior to you guys issuing what is a semi-formal set of rules? It's that iterative process that happens before those go out that I guess I'm most curious about, especially if at the point you issued them, it better be a really good reason to be changed at that point, is kind of what I hear. But, what happens prior to that? How's that work?
I would say you would need to reach out, whether through our email or through Melanie or Tom. And we can certainly set up a meeting with your organization and sit down with y'all and offer whatever assistance or your feedback, because we would like to have your feedback.
Yeah, but my feedback on what? So,
Okay, okay.
So I'd say, Tom, you probably want to cover this with the next policy meeting,
So
probably.
again, this is kind of new for us as well. So the formal rulemaking, there are limits on what kind of dialogue can happen, but this is upstream of all of that. So we are wanting you to know, or wanting to have, wanting you to let us know, what, for example, would be the impacts of the model rule. And if you could say, this component of the model rule is too expensive to implement on oil and gas wells that are, I'm just throwing this out for discussion, beyond a certain age. Like if you've got an oil well that's, or a production, like if you've got a stripper well, a marginal well that's producing 15 barrels a day, you could come in and let us know that you think it would be impractical to, say, for example, implement these rules on a facility of that size with that low of production. And that would help us have the warrants, the logic and the justification to consider either delaying, reducing the requirements, or even exempting some facilities altogether. And so those dialogues would occur ideally within the next 60 days, or even after we've shared our initial policy ideas. So again, we don't, the model rule is out there, but we don't have a state rulemaking in play. And so we are looking for information that will inform our policy choices. Like, do we exempt a certain number of wells? Do we implement some requirements because they get cost-effective emission reductions? It may turn out, for example, that maybe a particular technology, maybe updating the pneumatic controllers is something that's done anyway, is not too expensive, but would give meaningful emission reductions. And so maybe we implement those and maybe defer others or exempt others altogether. So we're really looking for, it's wide open. And the more information in terms of like cost, complexity, but also the impacts. Like if this model rule is put into place, if you have to close half of your wells down, that's important information for us to know. Or if it increases the cost to the degree that it would, reduce the viability of a particular aspect of the sector, or, affect, integration between upstream and midstream and make it more expensive to get gas into, a midstream pipeline. All of that information is helpful for us. It will help us craft policies. And then we plan on sharing the policies in another formal meeting, but that's not the only formal meeting. It's now on February 3rd.
So to get started, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the rules issued or the guidance as issued by the EPA, and I'm going to then highlight the impacts that I see from that. Or am I going to then, would I say, this is workable if it worked this way instead of the way proposed? So I'm going to use that And I need to get that back to you along with cost numbers if I have them and stuff like that within the next 60 days.
If that's practical. That is our hope.
Okay, that's what I have.
Thank you. Anyone else in the room?
I'm Brian McCown with Oklahoma Gas and Electric. Kendall mentioned at the beginning, new administration. There's also significant litigation over these rules. In fact, this coming Friday, oral argument at the DC Circuit over the power plant rules. And so one thought that we had was DEQ develops a regulation that should have some kind of off-ramp to address that litigation if the federal rule becomes inapplicable. Second comment, the emission guidelines for the power plants include 4 options for alternate standards of performance. Right there in the rule, EPA acknowledges that these are good alternates that need to be equivalent to or get equivalent or better emission reductions than the presumptive performance standard. And so we'd like to have the flexibility to use those. Don't know if it would work or not for us or other companies, but at least have the flexibility to do that. That's at 60.5775B E1, a couple of pages in the rule there. And also a comment on the concept of the regulation being the vehicle for the plan. In subpart BA, the implementing rules for 111D plans, there's provision for the performance standard could be contained not only in a rule, but in a permit or an enforcement order of some sort. And we would like to be able to consider that as well. I think that has some benefits. Because it wouldn't have to go through the regulatory process. It might be able to be done in a little more timely manner. Might also give us a little more time to develop the plan and maybe let some of the litigation play out. We might actually know what real requirements are instead of the uncertainty waiting for litigation. So again, just would like to have the option to be able to do that.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
I will say, we are getting a new administration, but we are also well aware of the litigation that's going on.
Yeah.
And we know if a judge, a court does come down at any given time with a decision, we are able to pivot on the direction that we will go down and work with what the ruling says or what the new administration says. So we do that on a regular basis with all the litigation and new administrations coming back and forth. So we are watching it and we are aware.
Another point that you brought up, Brian, you had mentioned it before, was about the possibility of doing something different, not rulemaking for the power plant sector. Again, it is a different animal slightly, obviously, than the oil and gas sector, and we have not ruled that out. We did, obviously, for this presentation, kind of go path of least resistance and most normal, but that has not been taken off the table. So appreciate you bringing that up again.
And we can provide maybe some more detail and rationale.
Thank you. Anyone else in the room before we check back online? Tina, do we have anybody online?
I am not seeing any other raised hands online.
One more time in the room. If we don't have anybody else that wants to speak in the room or online, again, we will take a 15-minute recess just to see if there's anybody else that thinks of something or pops on. And if we come back from 15 minutes and nobody has anything, we will adjourn early. Okay, we'll start that 15-minute timer. We are going to go muted in the room for those online Zoom participants. We will go quiet. If you want to say anything, please step forward or raise your hand online. All right, we're coming back from our break. We did want to go back really quickly, just based on some of the comments and feedback that we got. Remind everyone that we are going to be putting these questions that Tom had in his presentations out on our website soon, in the very near future. Again, these are the type of questions we're looking for feedback on. This is not an exhaustive list, and it may evolve slightly. So those would be more for industry. And next slide. This would be more public community type input, civic organizations, cities, municipalities, blogs, any other groups that might have some of this community type information as well would be welcome to provide that input. So those will be, again, on our website, so please stay tuned. Anyone else in the room that would like to speak before we check online and then look to adjourn? Right, Christina, anyone online?
There are no raised hands online at this moment.
Okay, so again, we want to thank everyone in person and online for your attendance and feedback here today. And as I mentioned before, this presentation will be posted on our new 111D webpage in a few days. In addition, the webpage will be kept up to date with any recent activity like the questions we just looked at. So please check back often to stay informed with our progress. In the meantime, as both Leon and Tom said, we'll be taking additional feedback through that February 3rd date. It's not a hard date, but that's when we're hoping to get most of our feedback in. So please use the email addresses that they showed and that are also on this screen for any additional input or questions that you may have in the interim. You can use this bottom URL or the QR code to sign up to our air quality public notice list on GovDelivery. And this is how most of our future meetings are going to be communicated, in addition to posting everything obviously on our website. When you go to this QR code, please be sure to check your GovDelivery subscriptions. We did have some emails that went out and may have signed up for air quality health advisories instead of this one. So please make sure that you are subscribed to the air quality public notice list. Most of you, I think, probably in the room are also subscribed to our Air Quality Advisory Council. So when you check those subscriptions, I would suggest checking that box as well, because that is how we normally do our rulemakings, through the Air Quality Advisory Council listserv as well. So again, we appreciate your time and attendance here today, both online and in person, and we look forward to the additional feedback in future meetings with all of you. So hope everyone has a great evening. And with that, we will let everybody go a little early. Thank you. To the gavel, Austin.